So I'm going to go through the first group, the umbrella of adoptionism associated with Antioch. And the first example of it is called Ebionism. Jesus is a human being whom God has singled out and chosen for special favor. He's like a prophet. And the word that the Bible uses for these singled out, blessed people once in a while in the Old Testament is Son of God. David is called Son of God in the Old Testament. So when the voice speaks over Jesus at his baptism and says, "You are my son. I'm well pleased with you." Ebionites read that as God's favor on a mere human being. Not the Word made flesh, instead an inspired prophet. Not God the Son, but a beneficiary of God's grace. And a great example for us all. Even someone who is chosen to deliver God's message, God's wisdom. Now, in the early church, this was not a popular position. It died out pretty quickly. On the other hand, as you can notice from some of my examples, this is probably the most popular alternative to Orthodox Christianity in the world today. Because Muslims' position on Jesus is basically Ebionite. Islam understands Jesus to be a word from God and a spirit from him, the Quran says. The Quran even says that he was born of a virgin. Nevertheless, he is merely a human being, merely a messenger from God, a Rasul Allah, like the other prophets, whose word, whose message is the same message as all the prophets' messages. So who is Jesus according to Muslims? Your typical Muslim has a higher respect for Jesus than your typical American or your typical Westerner, because they regard him as a prophet. But they don't worship him. And there are about 1 billion Muslims in the world. So you might think of this school, this heresy, this rejected teaching, as one that has taken on a life of its own outside Christian circles and is the clearest rival. Another example of Ebionite thinking is in early Unitarianism. Unitarians in the 17th century regarded God's oneness, God's unity as fundamental, and Jesus' divinity didn't make rational sense. And so they regarded Jesus as a great teacher, as a moral exemplar, but only a human being. So maybe the wisest human being, and maybe the best human being to follow among all human beings as a result, but not to be worshipped, not the Lord. All right? Unitarians deny the Trinity by excluding Jesus from the identity of God. Same way Muslims do. Same way Ebionites did. So those are two schools outside the Christian camp. What about inside the Christian camp? And here I've drawn on a wonderful book by C. Fitzsimmons Allison called The Cruelty of Heresy. The title of the book alone is worth the book. The church isn't just uptight when it condemns church teachings as heretical. Heresies are cruel. Heresies lock people out of the new relationship that we have and the new grace and the new gift that we have in Jesus Christ because they train people to misunderstand it. Allison isn't after, Muslims or Unitarians. Well, he's after people within the church itself who don't formally deny the divinity of Christ. But what if you grew up in a church where Jesus was always stressed as a good example, as a teacher, and really treated only in that way? No one ever formally denied his divinity, but what if the representation of Jesus that you grew up with always and only stressed his teaching, his example? You'd be you'd be liable to a kind of functional Ebionism, where you might not think of Jesus as an intercessor, as a source of forgiveness. You might not think of Jesus as the one the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, the ruler of all rulers, the ruler of all nation states and corporations and schools and churches and families. Because you always grew up with Jesus, the one who supplies the answer to your question or wisdom in a situation. Okay? Maybe you got a WWJD bracelet. Do they still have those, or are those extinct? And that's the only way you ever related to Jesus, was asking, what would he do in this situation? I'll do what he does. As you see, that is actually a somewhat better example of the next teaching that we're going to discuss. But you can see how Christians, well-meaning members of Orthodox churches, can drift away from the Orthodox faith without even knowing it. We have to be careful. Just because we call ourselves Orthodox doesn't make us Orthodox.